It's good to be able to worship the Lord together and to share in communion together as well. Well, this morning I'd like us to begin a three-part series in the book of Esther in the Old Testament. So today will be part one. The next couple of times that I preach, I'll endeavour to do parts 2 and 3, but there'll be kind of gaps between them. It's a book that's got 10 chapters in it. Some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not be. We've only been able to read chapter 1 this morning. What I would encourage you to do is when you get an opportunity, maybe have a cup of coffee, cup of tea, and sit and read the book of Esther. It's history, and it is an intriguing and captivating historical account. But as we go through it, you'll see that. Well, by way of introduction, let me just say that in the year 2000, one of the most important trials regarding the Holocaust took place at the High Court in London. It was a landmark case in which David Irving sued the historian Deborah Lipstadt and her publisher Penguin Books for libel. In a 1993 book, she had called David Irving a Holocaust denier. He lost his case. So indeed he was a Holocaust denier. Soon after winning her victory over Irving, Lipstadt went to hear the book of Esther read at her local synagogue. And when the words of chapter 4 verse 14 were read, and who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this, she reflected on it, and then she went on to say, it made me think, who knows if not for this very reason I got the education I got the upbringing I got, my job, maybe we're all meant to do something really significant. And some of us do it on the public stage, and some of us do it by helping a child. Nobody knows it, nobody sees it, but we're all meant to do something. Well, most people don't get the limelight and the public stage that Lipstadt got. I don't imagine any of us here have been in any high court legal battle. But her reaction to the book of Esther was not unusual. Both Christians and Jews have been reading this book for centuries and reacting in similar ways. Something about the book of Esther makes us take stock of our lives and wonder what God is up to. And given, and as we've been reminded already this morning, that we are living in a time of increasing anti-Semitism and hostility towards Israel, I thought it might be useful to remind ourselves that God is in control of geopolitics, and he's also in control of the seemingly insignificant things that take place in the lives of individual people. And it has always been this way. Think back to the book of Genesis and how Joseph's brothers hated him. They sold him into slavery in Egypt, only to discover many years later that God has used their actions to save Egypt and the surrounding nations from famine. And Joseph understood, with hindsight, what had happened. And in Genesis 50, verse 20, he told his brothers this: you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And so it is with the book of Esther. God using events in the lives of individuals to bring about geopolitical change and salvation. Now, everyone loves a good story, and this is why I was encouraging you to maybe go away and read these 10 chapters. The events in the book of Esther are captivating. It's about a young orphan, a foreign Jewish girl who becomes queen of a great empire. It's about the Jewish community in exile being threatened with genocide by an evil egomaniac. It's about the triumph of right over wrong, the triumph of God's people over their enemies. The events evolve around a fickle king called Xerxes, or, if you saw it on the screen, Ahasuerus. Now, just by way of explanation, Ahasuerus is the Hebrew version, whereas Xerxes is the Greek. So if you were confused there, same man, just different languages. But the events revolve around this fickle king, Xerxes, a sinister prime minister called Haman, a Jew with unshakable convictions called Mordecai, a young orphan called Esther who develops into a woman of immense courage. And throughout all the plots and the counterplots, we can clearly see the hand of God at work. And if you are familiar with the book of Esther, you will be aware that it has no explicit reference in it to God whatsoever, nor to worship, nor to prayer. And so on the face of it, it may seem strange. And over the years, it's given rise to considerable debate and discussion. Nevertheless, despite the absence of any direct reference to God, it is abundantly clear that he is controlling and directing all the seemingly insignificant coincidences that take place, so that ultimately his purposes are worked out. And my intention is that we work through the book over 3 sermons, and so we'll look at part 1 today, and then next time I'm up here, we'll look at part 2 and so on. And this morning, we're going to look at the first 2 chapters. So if you've got your Bibles, keep them open, because we only read chapter 1. We're going to look at the first 2 chapters and the first few verses of chapter 3. So we're going to run a little bit into chapter 3. And in looking at those chapters, firstly, we will look at the demise of Vashti, the demise of Queen Vashti in chapter 1. Secondly, we'll look at the rise of Esther in chapter 2, verses 1 to 18. And then thirdly, we'll consider the surprise of Mordecai at the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. So the demise of Vashti, the rise of Esther, the surprise of Mordecai. And so we begin in chapter 1 with the demise of Vashti. And the first 11 verses set a scene for us. There's a problem brewing. We have King Xerxes, who ruled an enormous empire stretching from India to Ethiopia. And the capital of the empire was Susa, which is in modern-day Iran. Now, historians tell us that Persian kings were great banquet givers, and Xerxes is no exception. So in verse 3, we read that he hosted a banquet for the military and the royalty of his empire. It was a feast for all the movers and shakers, and anybody who was somebody was there. And as well as hosting a banquet, prior to it, he put on an enormous display of national wealth. And verse 4 tells us that it ran for a staggering 180 days, almost 6 months of lavish celebration and indulgence, showing off the splendor of the Persian Empire. And then in verse 5, we move into the banquet that followed that 180-day display of wealth. And the banquet was for everyone that was in the citadel of Susa, a great affair, and great opulence. Verses 5 to 8, we get a description of it. The garden hangings, the marble pillars, the golden couches, the silver fastenings, the luscious mosaic pavements, the individual golden goblets. And then verse 7 sums it up, talking about the king's liberality. And to keep everyone happy, there was an open bar. Each man could drink whatever he wanted. And while the king was entertaining the men, in verse 9 tells us that there was a similar banquet being hosted by Queen Vashti for the women. Now, on the face of it, it seemed like the mother of all parties, the culmination of 6 months of national pride and self-indulgence by the king, and it must have been a massive ego trip for him to parade all his wealth and then to put on the bash of the century. But the whole thing was about to implode on Xerxes. Proverbs 16, verse 18, warns us that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. And we're also warned in Proverbs 20, verse 1, that wine is a mocker and beer is a brawler, and whoever is led astray by them is not wise. So after 180 days of pampering his ego and 7 days of drinking himself silly, Xerxes, in verses 10 and 11, sent for Vashti in order to parade her beauty before a bunch of half-drunken men. And in verse 12, she said no. And you can imagine that the all-powerful king, with an empire stretching from India to Ethiopia, became the centre of attention in a way that he hadn't planned. The man who could command 127 provinces, was publicly embarrassed by a wife who effectively said, "No way, Jose," or "No way, Xerxes." And at the end of verse 12, he was incandescent with rage. So what are we to make of it all? We're not royalty, we don't live in Persia, our circumstances are very different to those of Xerxes, Vashti, or any of their guests. So is it just a good story from the history books? Well, no. There are very pertinent lessons for us to learn, because I've already said the crisis was precipitated by ego, pride, and alcohol. Many years ago, I had a boss who fitted the Xerxes mold. And on one occasion, we were away on a residential team building event. And he had had far too much to drink. And in front of around 20 or so of his staff, he asked his senior managers, which was myself and another guy, to publicly say in front of all of these staff who we thought the worst performing people in the department were. Well, we had no problem discussing the performance of people privately, but not publicly. And so my colleague said, "We're not happy to discuss it here. We'll discuss it with you on Monday morning in the office if you want. But we won't do it here." He was incandescent with rage because he felt that he'd been publicly rebutted and humiliated. And his ego took a bruising. And my colleague and I, we didn't have an easy time working for him after that. He's the worst guy I ever worked for. And it was precipitated by a refusal to his drunken demand, basically. Well, ego and pride are not desirable characteristics, and Xerxes' humiliation at the hands of his wife serves as a warning. We need to be on our guard against pride and avoid thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought. Pride is a real and present danger. So perhaps in your place of work you've had or you do have a position of seniority. Don't think that it couldn't go to your head. Perhaps academically you're an achiever. Don't think that pride can't get the better of you. Perhaps you've been blessed with monetary wealth. Don't think that it couldn't pamper your ego and result in pride. Perhaps you have a high profile in the local community or maybe with a charity. Don't think that pride couldn't come in and go to your head. Christians need to be aware of the danger of pride and be on our guard. And the way to do it is to take on board Paul's exhortation in Philippians 2 verse 3, where we're told, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves." Do nothing out of out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. In short, we're called to be Christ-like. Secondly, Xerxes is a real warning of the dangers of alcohol. I've already referred to Proverbs 20 verse 1, where we're told wine is a mocker and beer is a brawler, and whoever is led astray by them is not wise. Well, Xerxes found that out. High spirits and revelry soon came in, and there was an abrupt halt as his wife publicly refused to comply with his drunken instruction. The Bible warns against the abuse of alcohol for good reason, and it is something that we should take seriously. It's a practical thing. If Xerxes had shown a little more restraint, he wouldn't have ended up with what became a personal and a very public crisis. So we need to be careful with alcohol. Well, having considered that there's been a problem brewing, we should now give some thoughts to Queen Vashti's defiant stance. Was she right to refuse her husband's instruction? Biblical teaching, for example, in Ephesians 5 on the marriage relationship, has much to say about submission. So should Vashti have complied with her husband's drunken request to parade her beauty in front of a bunch of sozzled men? Should a woman's beauty be a public commodity for a man to use for his own ends? Was Xerxes' command culturally acceptable? Was it culturally acceptable, what are we talking about, 2,500 years ago in Iran? Or has culture nothing to do with it, and was he just a straightforward misogynist? Nearly 40 years ago, a friend and I went backpacking in Egypt. It was the first time I'd ever been abroad, and as part of that kind of 6-week trip that we went on, we spent a very pleasant week sleeping on a beach on the Red Sea coast, looking across to Jordan. And it was very pleasant, and it was quiet, and it was empty, until an Egyptian bank holiday. And as you would expect, a bank holiday, the crowd all came down from Cairo for a day or two at the seaside. Well, my mate and I, we'd got on quite well with this German couple, Eric and his girlfriend, whose name I can't remember. And on this bank holiday, my friend, myself and Eric were trying to throw a frisbee around. And there were just too many people. We couldn't throw this frisbee properly and have a bit of fun on the beach. So Eric went up to his girlfriend and said something to her. Now, she was slim, attractive, and wearing a bikini. And about 10 minutes later, him having had a word with her about something, the beach emptied, and we had so much space to throw this frisbee, and so we could just get on with our game. Now, Eric was really impressed with himself. What he had done was he'd had a word with his girlfriend and said, "Can you go swimming further down the beach?" And he had shamelessly used the fact that she was slim, attractive, and wearing a bikini in an environment where the Egyptian ladies went into the sea in full dress and headdress. And the guys just weren't used to seeing, the Egyptian men just weren't used to seeing somebody dressed like Eric's girlfriend. And he had shamelessly used her beauty and dress to clear the beach for us, because all the Egyptian guys just happened to drift down to that part of the beach where she was. And I mean, we were laughing about it, but seriously, I'm amazed that that girl ever did what he asked her, but she did. Well, Xerxes had spent 180 days displaying the splendor of his kingdom. He'd thrown the mother of all parties, displaying his liberality. He'd spent 7 days drinking wine with the men of the citadel. And it's almost as if the crowning splendor of the display of his material possessions was now going to be paraded before them, his wife. She was going to be the finale of his self-indulgent displays. And he shamelessly wanted to use her beauty for his own ends. But unlike Eric's girlfriend, Queen Vashti said no. She wasn't going to be paraded in front of a bunch of drunks. Now, some might say that Vashti maybe should have been more compliant and acceded to her husband's instruction. In particular, she maybe should have thought about the implications of saying no. Maybe she did. The narrative doesn't tell us. If she'd given it more thought, she might have realised it would cause a scandal. And culturally, perhaps, maybe she shouldn't have defied the king. But that still didn't alter the fact that Xerxes wanted to parade her beauty before a bunch of drunks. So surely her defiance was brave. Her beauty was her own and her husband's, not for explicit public display in front of a bunch of leering men. And it raises a number of issues for us that I'm not necessarily going to answer. But is there a point at which it is right in a marriage relationship for a wife to say no to her husband, particularly when he's showing a complete lack of love and respect and is showing effectively complete selfishness? I'll leave you to ponder that one, but I suspect you might know where I might be coming from. Well, having taken her stance, Queen Vashti effectively sealed her own fate, and the whole affair quickly becomes one of a state affair in verses 13 to 22. As far as the king and his advisors were concerned, it became a matter of national importance and required the passing of a new law which would exile a queen in verse 19 and identifying that every man should rule over his own household in verse 22 of chapter 1. If it wasn't so tragic the whole affair, in a sense, would have been comedic, an overreaction. What should have been an embarrassing incident between a man and his wife that required sorting out privately results in an empire-wide edict being issued from India to Ethiopia. Now, the rejection of Vashti shows us a number of things. Firstly, Xerxes was a weak and uncertain character. He called in his advisors when surely he maybe should have been sorting things out himself. Secondly, he was a manipulated character. His advisors got him to issue unnecessary laws, and that was a major flaw. And if you read through the book, you'll see that that character flaw resurfaces in chapter 3, when the evil Haman, the prime minister, persuades him to issue a law sanctioning the genocide of the Jews. So he was a manipulated character. And then thirdly, his advisors seemed to be completely out of touch with what marriage is all about. Memucan in verse 16 goes way overboard by saying that Vashti hasn't only wronged the king, but every citizen of the empire. Seriously? Every citizen of the empire. And his rantings then spiral out of control to the extent that at the end of verse 18 he says, Vashti's refusal to the king will result in no end of disrespect and discord. Did he really believe that marriages across the whole of the empire were so shaky that Vashti's refusal would trigger a chain reaction of disrespect and collapsing marriages? Weren't people more likely, if they'd got the news, just to shrug their shoulder and say, what planet do the royals live on? It's kind of the thing we would maybe say today, wouldn't it? But anyways, advisors managed to persuade Xerxes to legislate about a husband's authority in verse 22. No amount of external legislation will bring respect into a marriage relationship. But as a consequence of listening to his advisors, the law was passed and Xerxes rejected his wife. And that brings us on to chapter 2 and the rise of Esther. It begins with Vashti being banished as a result of Xerxes' hot temper. The old queen has gone, and now it's time to find a new queen. And again, the king lets other people in chapter 2 do his thinking for him. And they suggest, hey, why not have a beauty contest? And the winner gets to become the queen. And so in verses 12 to 14 of chapter 2, we get details of the beauty contest. 12 months of beauty treatment, and then at some point a night with the king. And it's into this beauty competition that we see Esther entering the narrative. And it's here that we see God acting providentially. A young orphaned Jewish girl is given the gift of beauty and is pulled into this competition and effectively becomes God's servant for rescuing his people. God has prepared a plan for rescuing his people even before their enemies had hatched their genocidal plot. And doesn't that ring true with how God planned our salvation in Jesus before the creation of the world? So let's never, ever forget that our God is in control of all the geopolitical events that go on and all the individual, seemingly insignificant things in our lives. Esther was brought in, positioned, even before the plot to wipe out the Jews was even a thought. Well, in chapter 1, we've seen a proud, drink-filled, manipulated and godless king divorce his wife because she didn't comply with his unreasonable instruction. People decide and act for themselves in ways that are often wrong. But God works in those circumstances to bring about his purposes. And in chapter 2, we have God bringing his purposes into being and gradually moving Esther to centre stage. God's purposes are not frustrated by the wickedness of men. He can overrule and he brings about his preordained will. And everything that happens to us isn't necessarily good, as Romans 8, verse 28 tells us. In all things, though, God works for the good of those who love him. Or as William Cowper's famous hymn puts it, God moves in a mysterious way his wonders to perform. And so it was with Esther. And so she was drawn into this beauty contest, and it wasn't a quick affair by any means. Each girl had to undergo a year of beauty treatment, 6 months with oils and then 6 months with perfume and cosmetics. 12 months of pampering. How do the ladies in the congregation like the idea of that? 12 months of pampering. As a bloke, in all honesty, I cannot imagine 12 months of pampering like that. It takes some getting your head round. Anthea has gone off occasionally to one of these spa places for maybe a day or a day and a half. But 12 months? Seriously? And these days, it's not just perfume and cosmetics either, is it? Cosmetic procedures are available. Tucks and nips, injections and fillers. And just as an aside, should a male preacher comment on a woman's beauty treatment? It's a brave man that does, so maybe I'm going to be brave or stupid. Let me just share with you a couple of tongue-in-cheek things. W.P. Nicholson, an evangelist in the early 20th century in Northern Ireland, is reputed to have asked the ladies in a particular congregation to raise their hands if they did not wear makeup. And then, proudly, remember what we said about pride earlier, proudly, lots of ladies raised their hands. And this evangelist, don't ask me how he dared say this, but this evangelist said, ladies, it's a poor old barn door that doesn't improve with a lick of paint. But there is another perspective, and it's in the form of a little ditty. Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to pass a chemist shop and call your face your own. Or perhaps these days, dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone, dare to pass a Botox clinic and call your face your own. True beauty is way deeper than even a year of pampering and cosmetic treatment. 1 Peter chapter 3 tells us it comes from a gentle and quiet spirit. And as you read chapter 2 of Esther, you sense that Esther's beauty was way more than skin deep. It was her character, and she was viewed favourably by everybody who came into contact with her. She found favour with Haggai in chapter 2, verse 9, which ensured she got special treatment. And then in verse 15, we're told that she won the favour of everyone who saw her. And then as we move down to verse 17 of chapter 2, we see that she won the king's favour too. You sense that hers was not only a visible beauty, but beauty as a person. God was bringing Esther to prominence just at the right time. And in verse 17, we go on to read that she was made queen. Well, what are we to learn from Esther's experience? Certainly not the endorsement of beauty contests. Rather, we should be encouraged by the bigger picture. It's God's picture, the Lord working out his purposes through the circumstances of our lives. He may well now be preparing us for a future role that we are completely unaware of. For Esther, it was going to be another 5 years before the plot to wipe out the Jews surfaced, when she would play her role in and her part in their salvation. It's unlikely that we know now the plans that the Lord has for us in the future. So our responsibility is to faithfully serve him here and now and trust him with the future. And that's effectively what Esther did. She had no knowledge that in a few years she would take centre stage. She just got on and did what she was supposed to do in the here and now. And we too should just faithfully serve the Lord where we are now, as he may be preparing us for something in the future. Well, having considered the demise of Vashti and the subsequent rise of Esther, we move on to the surprise of Mordecai. And he is a key character in the events of the book of Esther as the story unfolds. He is Esther's older cousin and guardian. He's a man of integrity. He cared for Esther when she was orphaned, verse 7 of chapter 2. And he when she joined the royal beauty contest, he visited every day to find out how she was getting on. That's verse 11. He was a Jew whose ancestry went back to King Saul. That's verse 5. And chapter 3, verse 3 tells us he was also a royal official. Now, the surprise regarding Mordecai is at the end of chapter 2, he exposes an assassination plot against King Xerxes, but he was never given any official recognition for exposing that plot. He dutifully served King Xerxes and saved Xerxes' life, but no honor was given to him. Now, history records Persian rulers as rewarding such benefactors, and for such an act of loyalty and bravery that Mordecai was involved in, he could have expected a number of benefits, including a significant promotion, exemption from taxes, and very importantly, as you look at chapter 3, being exempt from having to bow to other nobles. But chapter 3 begins with a surprise, because instead of reading that Mordecai was honoured for his loyalty, we read that after these events, King Xerxes honoured Haman. And this is the first time we get the sinister, evil Prime Minister Haman coming on the scene. And it all seems so unfair that the wrong man is honoured. But as you move through the book, you will see in chapter 6 that through a remarkable series of coincidences, God ensures that truth and justice prevail. We need to trust God with the events in our lives, with the events that go on in the world around us. But that's largely for next time. In the meantime, we should be encouraged by Mordecai's loyalty and integrity. He cared for his needy relative, which was a considerable commitment. He was visiting the palace every single day. Perhaps you've got responsibility for caring for a needy relative. Well, be encouraged. Although it's not necessarily easy, it's important. And God sees your devotion. Mordecai was a man who showed care and devotion and commitment, and God saw him doing this. Well, our time, yes, well and truly gone. We're at 10 to 12. More of Mordecai, Esther, Haman, and Xerxes next time I'm up. But in the meantime, let's heed the warnings of Xerxes, avoid the dangers of pride, ego, and excessive alcohol. Let's applaud Vashti for refusing to parade her beauty in front of a bunch of half-drunk men. Let's play our part in refusing to accept the inappropriate parading of women's beauty for the titillation of men. Let's be encouraged by Esther, who found favour of everyone who saw her. And importantly, let's be encouraged as we see God clearly putting her in place so that she's there in the right place at the right time. And I want to finish with a verse from the Psalms. Psalm 139, verse 16, and one that's worth committing to memory. God has a plan for each of our lives, and Psalm 139, verse 16 says, all the days of our lives, all the days ordained for us are written in his book before any one of them comes to pass. All the days ordained for us are written in God's book before any one of them comes to pass. That was true for Esther, as we'll see next time, and it's true for you, and it's true for me. So may God bless us as we reflect on these things. Thanks for your attention.